The conference room smelled faintly of coffee and polished wood, a sterile aroma softened only by the sunlight filtering through half-closed blinds. The fluorescent lights hummed softly, bouncing off the white walls, making the air feel sharper, more expectant. I adjusted my blazer, straightened my spine, and let my fingers graze the edge of the polished table. The projector clicked on, slicing the dim light with a rectangle of bright white. My slides appeared. Clean. Minimal. Each word deliberate. My idea wasn't just ambitious, it was ahead of its time. As I began to speak, I could feel the subtle shifts around the table. Chairs creaked. Eyes darted. Some colleagues leaned back, smirking. A few whispered to one another. The words low but unmistakable. She doesn't get big strategy. The laughter started small, light, tentative, almost like a ripple, but it quickly grew. A sharp chuckle here, a soft snort there. The room vibrated with it, a collective disbelief that my proposal could even be considered. Some shook their heads, others exchanged glances, eyebrows raised. I noticed the subtle micro-gestures. Crossed arms, fingers tapping lightly against a notepad. The way a hand shielded a mouth to hide a smile. I didn't flinch. I didn't try to argue or soften my idea. I let the silence that followed my words settle like dust. My shoulders remained squared, my chin slightly lifted, my hands relaxed on the table. My voice, calm and measured, cut through the ripple of mockery. "Here is how we can transform our approach," I said, letting each word land deliberately, letting the slide behind me reinforce the vision I had crafted so carefully. I noticed a colleague trying to stifle a laugh, the corners of her mouth twitching. Another adjusted his tie nervously, perhaps realizing that even though he wanted to dismiss me, the concept had weight he couldn't yet define. I continued, sliding to the next frame. The design was clean, but the numbers told a story of growth, of risk, of early adoption. My breath was steady, almost meditative, and I let it guide the rhythm of my speech. I made no jokes, no defensive remarks, no attempts to win anyone over with charm. The quiet confidence in my tone was intentional. Each pause, each careful gesture, was part of the narrative. I was not desperate for approval. My authority didn't need applause. My idea didn't need validation in the moment. It only needed a witness. The laughter continued, though now it carried a different texture. Unease threaded through the amusement. I could feel it in the subtle shift of the room. Some colleagues leaning forward slightly, scanning the slides with more attention, the smirk fading from their lips. My eyes scanned the table slowly, meeting their gazes without confrontation, holding them just long enough to communicate, "I see you. I know what you're thinking." And it doesn't shake me. My lips curved briefly into a faint, controlled smile. Not warmth, not arrogance, just acknowledgement. The kind of smile that says, "I am confident in my own brilliance, whether you understand it or not." Even the light seemed to cooperate with the moment. The sun outside dipped just enough to cast narrow beams across the table, highlighting the gentle sway of a chair, the twitch of a wrist, the subtle lean forward that betrayed curiosity amidst derision. The projector hummed softly, its glow outlining my face, accentuating the calm in my expression, the precision in my movements. I noticed everything: the way hands fiddled with pens, the way a colleague's foot tapped nervously, the subtle furrow of another's brow. Every micro-reaction was data, evidence that my idea had entered their consciousness, whether they wanted to admit it or not. I slowed my speech intentionally, letting moments stretch. If we adopt this framework, we can capture a market before our competitors even see the opportunity, I said, letting the weight of each phrase settle. I let silence fill the gaps. Silence has a language of its own, sometimes heavier than laughter. It forces attention. It demands contemplation. I could see it creeping into the room, even through the nervous laughter. A flicker of curiosity, a tightening of the jaw, the subtle lean-in of someone who was starting to take note. By the end of the presentation, the room had shifted imperceptibly. The laughter hadn't disappeared, but it had changed. There was now a tension beneath the surface, a quiet acknowledgement, unspoken, that maybe the idea wasn't absurd. My slides glowed against the whiteboard, my presence anchoring them. I collected my notes slowly, deliberately, letting the click of the binder echo in the stillness. I didn't rush. I didn't explain more than necessary. The room had seen the full spectrum: boldness, clarity, composure, and quiet power. I left the table last, my heels clicking softly against the polished floor, letting the echo mark my passage. Every head followed me just slightly, whether they wanted to or not. As I turned toward the door, I caught a fleeting glance from one colleague, a mixture of doubt, curiosity, and begrudging respect. I didn't react. I walked out with the same calm precision that had carried me through the presentation. The idea had been planted. The laughter had been noted. And I knew, deep in my chest, that time would reveal who had been right all along. The room still smelled faintly of coffee, but now it carried a tension you could almost touch, thick enough to make the air feel heavier. The fluorescent lights above hummed, steady and unforgiving, casting pale rectangles across the polished conference table. I remained standing, the projector's glow outlining my silhouette. My slides still shone behind me, crisp, clean, each chart and bullet point a reminder that the idea was real, structured, executable. The laughter from before had grown louder at first, but now something was changing. A few colleagues shook their heads, leaning back in chairs with exaggerated motions, as if disbelief could erase the concept. Others crossed their arms, a subtle shield against admitting that perhaps, just perhaps, this could work. Some whispered again, lower this time, a nervous undertone creeping into the ridicule. I noticed everything: the way hands fiddled with pens, the tapping of feet, the faint huffing of breath meant to fill silence. But I didn't move. I didn't respond. I didn't try to convince anyone. I let the weight of stillness do the work. My own breath slowed. Inhale, exhale. Inhale, exhale. The rhythm anchored me, grounding me in the moment, letting each micro-reaction around the room register clearly in my mind. I let the slight furrows, the subtle jaw tightening, the distracted glances at the screen, every tiny twitch paint a picture for me. They were paying attention. They just didn't know it yet. My hands rested lightly on the table's edge, fingertips grazing the surface, barely moving. My shoulders were squared, and my chin remained lifted just so. This quiet posture carried authority they couldn't mock. I moved to the next slide slowly, deliberately. The chart illuminated projections, timelines, potential market shifts. My voice, calm and precise, carried the numbers into the room without haste. By aligning this strategy, we can capture early adoption before competitors even recognize the trend. It's about timing, not risk. It's about foresight, not impulse. Each word landed in the silence between their murmurs. Each pause stretched long enough to feel its weight. I noticed a colleague, usually outspoken, leaning in slightly, hand resting near her mouth. Another man's eyes narrowed, not in mockery this time, but as if he were testing the logic against his own assumptions. The laughter, when it came, had a different texture. It was less certain now, edged with tension. It rolled across the room, not carefree or bright, but sharp and brittle, like cracking ice. They were trying to laugh it off, to hide their unease, and I let it wash over me without reaction. I didn't smirk. I didn't laugh. I didn't even flinch. My silence became louder than their noise. I shifted my weight slightly. A micro gesture they probably didn't even notice consciously, but it radiated calm, control, confidence. Quiet power isn't flashy. It's subtle. It's in posture, in breath, in stillness. I noticed other signs, more unconscious. Fingers pausing mid-tap on a notepad. A colleague's pen lowering as she studied the chart longer than she intended. A foot stopping its nervous tap. Curiosity was creeping in, threading through their skepticism like a faint golden light through the blinds. Their eyes flicked from slide to slide, back to me, back to the slide. I caught it, the flicker of engagement that they tried to hide behind smirks. This was the first crack in their certainty. I slowed my cadence further, letting each point sink in. "We don't need to wait for consensus," I said, letting the words hang. "We don't need applause. This is about clarity, about seeing the opportunity before anyone else does. And sometimes, seeing early is mistaken for being wrong. But results always tell the truth." My gaze moved slowly across the room, meeting eyes without confrontation, holding them just long enough to communicate that I was not shaken, not afraid, not defensive. My lips lifted faintly, not a smile of triumph, but a controlled acknowledgement of my own certainty. I let silence fill the pauses, letting tension stretch long enough for it to resonate. It worked differently than laughter. It forced attention. Subtly, almost imperceptibly. I noticed their glances darting at each other, the twitch of a jaw, the faint nod of recognition that they were absorbing the logic, whether they wanted to admit it or not. Some shifted slightly in their seats, leaning forward just a little. Subtle movements. But they meant something. The first crack had appeared. The idea had begun to take root, quietly, beneath the mockery. I moved to the final slide, the one that tied strategy to results. The numbers glowed under the projector, clean and undeniable. I spoke slowly, deliberately, letting each phrase settle. If we execute with discipline and timing, we create leverage that no reactionary measure can catch up to. We get the advantage by being ready before they even see the gap. My eyes scanned the room once more, taking in micro-reactions, the slight narrowing of eyes, the tilt of heads, the pens still hovering. The tension in the room was palpable now. A quiet acknowledgement that maybe, just maybe, the laughter had been premature. By the time I stepped back, my shoulders still squared, hands resting gently at my sides, the room had shifted imperceptibly. The laughter had faded into quiet murmurs. Eyes followed me, not all of them, not yet, but enough. I felt the subtle pulse of attention, the first acknowledgement of possibility, threading through the skepticism. I didn't rush to leave. I collected my notes slowly, deliberately, letting each click of the binder resonate in the room. A quiet punctuation to my presence. Finally, I walked toward the door, heels clicking softly against the polished floor. Every head turned, even if briefly. Glances flickered a mix of doubt, curiosity, and a begrudging respect they didn't want to name aloud. I didn't react. I didn't nod or smile. I simply moved with measured confidence, leaving the room with the knowledge that the first crack had been made. Time would do the rest. And deep in my chest, I felt the quiet power humming, a subtle promise that this idea would outlast their laughter. Be honest, what would you do if it was you sitting in that room? Drop your thoughts below. I want to hear you. 6 months had passed. The office smelled different now, stale coffee, the faint, metallic tang of old printer ink, the tension of stalled innovation. The same fluorescent lights hummed above, indifferent, casting the same rectangles of sterile glow across the conference tables. My former colleagues shuffled through meetings, charts, and endless brainstorming sessions, their voices low, tinged with frustration. Ideas that had once seemed simple now faltered. the room thick with uncertainty. Nobody seemed to notice, but I did, because I had already anticipated every gap, every hesitation, every blind spot. I wasn't there, not physically. I was elsewhere, in my own space, quiet and deliberate, refining the very strategy they had mocked. The contract was on my desk, finalized. $120,000, a number that spoke to the value of vision realized and of preparation executed with precision. I had sold the idea to a competitor, yes, but not in haste, not in spite. I had sold it in full confidence that the logic, the structure, and the timing were flawless. It wasn't about proving them wrong, it was about demonstrating what deliberate, early vision could achieve. Every step had been calculated, yet executed with subtlety. I didn't broadcast my moves. There were no dramatic emails, no public announcements, no social media posts. My brilliance was not performative, it was operational. Every spreadsheet, every draft, every projection had been layered, meticulous, ready for the moment when timing and opportunity aligned. And when it did, the validation arrived quietly, cleanly, without chaos, just undeniable evidence. The competitor's call came one late afternoon, the kind of golden light spilling across my office window that turns everything warm and sharp at the same time. "We're ready to move forward," they said, voice low but precise. The $120,000 figure settled like a soft weight in my chest. It was more than a number, it was acknowledgement. Tangible, measurable proof that foresight and strategy mattered. I leaned back in my chair, letting the sunlight warm my face, letting the moment sink in fully. I didn't celebrate outwardly. I didn't need to. The quiet satisfaction of seeing the plan succeed was its own reward. Meanwhile, the old office was still stuck. Meetings dragged on. Charts remained half-finished. Whiteboards covered in markers showed momentum lost in translation, ideas rejected too soon. I imagined their frustration, heard the undercurrent of whispered admissions. Maybe we should have, but it didn't matter what they thought now. The value of the idea was tangible. My preparation had turned into results, and results are harder to ignore than laughter. I had moved through all of this with intentional calm. Every night spent refining the proposal, every detail polished, every scenario considered, had been part of the quiet work. I didn't need recognition to feel the weight of what I had created. I was grounded in the reality of my own competence, my own brilliance. I had anticipated the skepticism, allowed it to play out, and let time prove the point. That is the essence of quiet power, letting preparation, foresight, and action speak louder than words ever could. By the time the contract was signed and executed, the first real acknowledgement of the idea's value emerged, not from applause, not from fanfare, but from numbers, metrics. Deadlines met, projections exceeded, the competitor benefited, the plan worked exactly as designed. And somewhere, in the echoes of boardrooms that still didn't grasp the full scope, my former colleagues began to feel it, the subtle sting of what had been dismissed, not in anger, not in malice, but in quiet, undeniable proof. I didn't gloat. I didn't send emails highlighting my success. I allowed the results to exist, visible yet unforced, like sunlight moving across the polished floors. Quiet power is not loud. Quiet power is measurable. And in that measure, I had everything I needed: validation, integrity, and brilliance. Recognized not through argument, but through outcome. The idea had spoken for itself. I had spoken with action. And in corporate America, action speaks louder than ridicule. I looked out the window that evening, the city stretching below, alive with possibility, and allowed myself a small, private acknowledgement of the strategy fulfilled. Everything aligned not by chance, not by luck, but by deliberate, calculated vision. This was the moment when early vision, patience, and strategic intelligence converged. And while the world outside might not yet fully comprehend the depth of the work, the results were incontrovertible. My brilliance had been proven in the quietest, most grounded way possible. The air in my apartment smelled faintly of jasmine and old books, a comforting contrast to the sterile hum of the corporate world I had left behind. I sat at my desk, papers neatly stacked, laptop open, sunlight spilling in through wide windows. The $120,000 contract was signed, the strategy validated, but my mind didn't linger on celebration. I had bigger steps to prepare for. Quiet power, I reminded myself, wasn't about immediate gratification. It was about planning, precision, and knowing your own worth before the world acknowledged it. I reviewed the company I was about to return to. I looked at their leadership charts, recent quarterly reports, and internal memos. Every weak point, every hesitation, every delay in their prior decision-making was logged in my mind. I made notes, subtle, almost invisible, but each line reinforced my path. My return wasn't going to be flashy. It wasn't going to be performative. It was deliberate, methodical, undeniable. The quiet confidence of preparation was more powerful than any confrontation could ever be. Every morning, I rehearsed my posture, my tone, my micro-expressions, the way I would enter the room, the slight lift of my chin, the slow, purposeful cadence of my speech, all of it was choreographed. I visualized the conference room, the lighting, the projector glow, even the faint hum of the air conditioner. I imagined each colleague's reaction, some curious, some defensive, some attempting to mask respect. I let the visualization settle into my muscles, into my bones, until walking back into that space felt inevitable, controlled, precise. I also prepared my documents, not flashy portfolios, not dramatic presentations, clean, minimal, strategic. Each figure had a rationale, each bullet a calculated move. I didn't need to prove them wrong, they would prove themselves, naturally, as I executed. Integrity guided every step. I wasn't building a narrative for the audience. I was constructing a path for reality to follow. My plan was subtle, yet unstoppable. Some afternoons, I would step away from the papers and just breathe, feeling the quiet pulse of confidence beneath the surface. My reflection in the window reminded me, the strategy wasn't just the numbers. It was the alignment of timing, foresight, and presence. Every choice I made, when to act, how to act, when to wait, was a measure of intelligence, not ego. I repeated this to myself like a mantra. Results are louder than ridicule. Integrity outlasts mockery. Quiet power endures. There were moments when I considered the past laughter, the sneers, the disbelief in the room. I allowed myself a private acknowledgement of it, not bitterness, not anger, just awareness. Those moments fueled clarity, but never impatience. I was not acting out of revenge. I was acting from strategy, grounded in foresight. I made mental notes of their weak points in leadership, the way decisions had stalled, the moments they had underestimated early vision. Every memory became data, every slight, a lesson. I also rehearsed my financial boundaries. When the company would call me back, they would offer a position. Yes, but I would ensure my value was recognized fully. Double the salary, higher position, respect aligned with responsibility. I ran scenarios in my mind. How I would respond to negotiation. How I would maintain composure if someone tried to undermine me. How to convey authority without arrogance. Each scenario was rehearsed until my responses felt organic, unshakable. Quiet confidence is built in preparation. Every action becomes a reflection of readiness. Even my personal environment was part of the strategy. I kept my calendar meticulous, my wardrobe intentional, my mornings calm and centered. Every detail, what I wore, how I carried myself, how I moved into meetings, was a statement without words. The world often misjudges quiet preparation as inaction. But I knew what was unseen often carries more weight than what is broadcast. The difference between being early and being wrong is patience, foresight, and action aligned with principle. Weeks passed. I allowed myself moments of reflection, looking back on the laughter in that first conference room. I didn't resent it. I didn't brood. Instead, I let it crystallize into clarity. The people who laughed had been unable to see the idea, while I had seen both the idea and its execution. That clarity became my edge. Each morning, each decision, each subtle movement reinforced that edge. My plan was not only to return, it was to return elevated, undeniable, aligned with both compensation and respect. By the time the phone call came, inviting me back to the company, everything felt like a natural progression, not a victory lap. I had anticipated their hesitation, their potential offers, the questions they might ask. I prepared for it all, not with arrogance, not with drama, but with quiet certainty. My strategy was complete, layered, and grounded. I was ready to step into the space they had once filled with laughter and fill it now with quiet authority, measured brilliance, and undeniable presence. And in that quiet, patient space, I allowed myself a small smile, not for revenge, not for recognition, but for the power of preparation, patience, and foresight. The plan had been tested in the market, validated, and rehearsed. Now, it was time for the final phase. Stepping back into the conference room, not as the underestimated, dismissed voice of early vision, but as a strategic force whose value could no longer be ignored. Quiet power isn't about being loud, it's about being ready when the moment demands it. And I was ready. You won't believe what happens next. Hit subscribe so you don't miss it. The morning sun slanted low through the blinds, casting long, thin stripes of light across the polished floor of the conference room. The air smelled faintly of coffee and paper, a subtle tension hanging in it like a quiet storm. I paused just outside the door, taking a slow, deliberate breath. Every detail mattered. The weight of my bag on my shoulder, the slight lift of my chin, the measured cadence of my steps as I entered. This wasn't just a room. This was the stage where patience, foresight, and quiet power would converge. I stepped in, heels clicking softly against the polished floor. Every colleague in the room glanced up or tried not to. I could feel the energy shift immediately, almost palpable. Those who had once laughed, once whispered, now avoided my eyes, shifting papers nervously, adjusting posture. The laughter from months ago had faded into an uneasy silence, the kind that stretches and waits. My shoulders were squared, my back straight, my hands lightly resting at my sides. I didn't rush. I let each step anchor me, a signal that I was present, prepared, and unshakable. The projector hummed softly, throwing the first slide onto the whiteboard. But it wasn't the slide that held the power, it was me. I let my gaze sweep the room slowly, making brief contact with each person. Some eyes darted away, unsure. Others lingered, registering subtle recognition. She was right all along. A faint smile tugged at my lips, not for amusement, not for triumph, just quiet acknowledgement that the moment I had prepared for had arrived. I didn't raise my voice yet. I didn't need to. The room was already listening. The hum of the projector, the slight creak of chairs, even the air felt different, charged with attention. I let the silence stretch, long enough for tension to settle, long enough for their minds to catch up to reality. Quiet power isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself. It's in presence, in stillness, in the gravity you carry without words. And now, I carried it fully. Finally, I spoke. My voice calm, measured, precise. Vision isn't crazy, I said, letting the words hang in the air for a moment, letting each ear catch the weight of them. Eyes lifted, heads turned. A few colleagues swallowed nervously, glances flicking between each other, as if to confirm that they had heard correctly. I let the pause linger, drawing their attention, commanding it without arrogance. Then, softer, but no less resolute. It's just early. The room was still, every head turned, every eye fixed. The silence wasn't uncomfortable, it was attentive. They weren't laughing. They weren't whispering. They were absorbing. The energy I had cultivated over months of preparation, foresight, and quiet strategy was palpable. Every subtle micro-gesture, the straightened spine, the controlled blink, the soft tilt of my head, spoke volumes. This wasn't about revenge. This was authority, grounded, undeniable. I moved through the slides, presenting updates, insights, and projections. Each point landed not just with logic, but with the credibility that comes from having been right when others doubted. I noticed glances flicking up from charts, eyes widening slightly, a pen hovering mid-air as someone reconsidered a note. They weren't just seeing the data, they were seeing the results of preparation, vision, and patience. My presence framed the narrative. The work spoke through me, but my calm, controlled delivery was the amplifier. Some colleagues tried subtle challenges, carefully phrased questions, but I handled them with measured clarity. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't dismiss anyone. I let facts guide the conversation. Quiet power allows space for engagement while maintaining authority. They realized, slowly, that what they had once dismissed as crazy was in fact calculated, deliberate brilliance. The room began to bend subtly toward acknowledgement. Resistance softened in the face of undeniable competence. As I concluded, I paused at the doorway, letting the weight of presence settle one last time. A colleague who had once mocked me avoided eye contact, a subtle shift in posture betraying the recognition they couldn't yet voice. Another leaned slightly forward, pen in hand, silent, reconsidering everything. The projector hummed softly behind me, casting the glow of my work onto the whiteboard, but it was my presence, the quiet authority, the patience, the brilliance that dominated the room. No gloating, no drama, just undeniable proof that preparation, patience, and vision matter more than ridicule ever could. I left the room slowly, deliberately, heels clicking against the polished floor. Every glance followed me. Some grudging, some curious, all registering the shift. The first crack had become recognition. The laughter from months ago was gone, replaced by the subtle, undeniable acknowledgement of truth. Quiet power had arrived at its apex, and as I walked away, I knew the work, the patience, the foresight, the brilliance. I had never needed anyone to believe me before. Time had proven the value, and I had let it speak for itself. If you've ever been overlooked or underpaid, this part's for you, and if you feel that, hit that. The conference room smelled faintly of polished wood and warm coffee, a comforting contrast to the tension that had once lingered here. I walked in that morning not as the underestimated voice of months ago, but as someone whose foresight, preparation, and strategic brilliance had already proven itself. The air felt different now, lighter, yet charged. Colleagues who had once laughed avoided my gaze, yet I could feel the subtle acknowledgement in the way chairs shifted and pens hovered. Every micro-gesture mattered. The slight tilt of a head, the careful pause in speech, the almost imperceptible nods. Recognition doesn't always announce itself with fanfare. Often it arrives quietly, like this. The leadership team was gathered, the executives poised and attentive. They were no longer questioning my ideas. They were listening. Their posture had changed subtly, straightened backs, hands resting lightly on the table, eyes meeting mine rather than darting away. The subtle tension of disbelief from months ago had dissolved into an almost reverent acknowledgement of the results I had delivered. They had seen the contract, the implementation, the metrics, every projection fulfilled. Quiet power had transformed into undeniable authority. I began to speak, voice calm and measured, projecting confidence without aggression. The strategy has been executed. The results are clear. Early adoption worked because preparation, timing, and execution aligned. The room was silent, every ear listening, every mind processing. I didn't need to emphasize my point. The data, the timeline, and the results spoke for themselves. Numbers had always been my ally now. They were their undeniable evidence. I let each figure sink in. Growth percentages, market capture, revenue, impact, efficiency gains. Every metric told the story they had once dismissed with laughter. One by one, subtle acknowledgments emerged. A nod here, a quiet murmur of agreement there. Even the executives who had questioned the feasibility of my idea months earlier now recognized the brilliance of what had been accomplished. There was no dramatic announcement, no loud celebration. This was grounded recognition. This was success measured by competence, not spectacle. And in that space, my quiet power felt full, complete, unshakable. Then came the offer, formal, deliberate, and precise. A promotion, a position higher than I had held before, accompanied by a salary that more than reflected my worth. Double, in fact, of what I had earned previously. But this wasn't about numbers. This was about acknowledgement of vision, intellect, and integrity. I didn't accept immediately, though I had known the answer long before the words were spoken. I allowed the room to witness the deliberation, not for drama, but to show the weight of thought and the value of measured decision-making. As I finally nodded in agreement, the subtle shift in energy was palpable. Respect flowed outward in small, careful gestures, hands unclenching, eyes meeting mine briefly, an unspoken acknowledgement of authority that had once been denied. I felt the quiet satisfaction of justice, not revenge, not schadenfreude, but recognition earned through strategy, patience, and brilliance. This was proof that being early, prepared, and grounded always pays off. I reviewed the room carefully, noticing the ones who had doubted, who had laughed, who had minimized early vision. Their expressions carried subtle lessons: humility, respect, and the silent understanding that brilliance can't be denied forever. My presence didn't intimidate. It simply reflected competence made visible. My success wasn't loud, it was undeniable. The strategy had been executed flawlessly, the recognition earned thoroughly, and the integrity preserved throughout. I allowed myself a brief, private smile, acknowledging the culmination of months of preparation, patience, and deliberate action. I didn't need applause. The acknowledgement of my value, the transformation of the room, and the validation of results were enough. This was quiet justice, grounded and complete. Every early doubt, every laugh, every micro gesture of disbelief had been met, not with drama but with excellence. That is the essence of smart revenge. Silent, strategic, undeniable. The team left the room with renewed focus. The energy shifted. I lingered for a moment, letting the quiet power settle into the space, knowing that the transformation was not only in the metrics, but in the perception of authority. My voice, my vision, My preparation all had spoken louder than any ridicule ever could. This was the moment when early vision, integrity, and strategic intelligence converged, delivering not just results, but grounded recognition, respect, and influence. And as I walked out, the sunlight catching the edges of my suit, I realized the full scope of the lesson. Success isn't about proving people wrong. It's about proving your own brilliance right. The room had witnessed it. The results were clear. And the justice? It was complete, measured, undeniable, and profoundly satisfying. The city outside my apartment was alive, sunlight reflecting off glass towers, the hum of cars and distant conversations blending into a rhythm that mirrored my own pulse. I sat at the window, coffee steaming in my hands, and let the events of the past months settle. From that first conference room, the laughter, the micro-doubts, the dismissive smirks, it all now existed as lessons, not wounds. I traced the rim of my mug with a fingertip, thinking not about revenge, but about clarity, preparation, and the quiet intelligence that had carried me through. Being early is often mistaken for being wrong. I had known this from experience long before the project succeeded. The moment one speaks a vision that doesn't fit the current consensus, skepticism arises. Sometimes outright ridicule follows. For Black women in corporate spaces, that skepticism is compounded by layers of bias, conscious or unconscious. I had experienced it. Colleagues assuming my ideas were too bold, too audacious, or simply not practical. And yet, what they perceived as a flaw was never a flaw, it was vision, ahead of its time, waiting for reality to catch up. I reflected on the months of preparation, the nights spent refining every detail, the careful rehearsal of presence, posture, tone, and timing, the days spent observing, documenting, and analyzing the environment I would one day re-enter. This preparation, so quiet, so meticulous, had become the backbone of my success. There was no drama, no confrontation, just deliberate, measured action. The strategy, executed with integrity, had spoken louder than ridicule ever could. That is the essence of grounded empowerment. I thought about the contract with the competitor, the $120,000 validation of foresight. I had been tempted to broadcast it, to let the doubters feel the sting of missed opportunity, but I didn't. True power doesn't need to announce itself. It manifests in results, in influence, in the unshakable confidence that comes from aligning vision with action. I had allowed the idea to exist, mature, and deliver value before stepping back into the old office. By the time I returned, recognition was not a request, it was inevitable. There is a broader truth here, one that extends beyond any single project or contract. For Black women navigating corporate America, the challenge is often twofold: proving competence in a space that questions it and holding on to early vision that others cannot yet see. Quiet, power, patience, preparation, and integrity are the tools to navigate this terrain. They allow one to move through spaces with authority without aggression, to demonstrate value without drama, and to claim recognition without resentment. This is not simply a strategy for career success, it is a methodology for self-preservation, empowerment, and lasting influence. I also reflected on the reactions of my colleagues, those who had doubted me, and those who had observed silently. Their surprise, hesitation, and eventual acknowledgement were reminders that perception is fluid. What is dismissed today may be celebrated tomorrow. What is mocked today may set new benchmarks tomorrow. The work, the preparation, and the integrity remain constant. Only the recognition changes. That is the subtle, enduring beauty of early vision. Empowerment does not require destruction of others. My revenge, as some might call it, was not about shaming anyone. It was about demonstrating the value of foresight, intelligence, and preparation in a world that often fails to recognize it. I had turned skepticism into proof, ridicule into acknowledgement, and early vision into measurable success. That is not drama. That is discipline. That is quiet power. That is the brilliance of being both strategic and authentic. As I watched sunlight shift across the cityscape, I realized that this lesson extends to every Black woman who has ever been told her ideas were too much or too early. The key is not to diminish your vision to fit others' expectations. The key is to hold it, refine it, prepare it, and act on it with integrity. Let the results speak. Let the work prove the value. Let patience amplify the brilliance. When the world catches up, you don't need to shout, it simply sees. I thought back to the first time I stood in that conference room, the projector light bouncing across my slides, the laughter, the smirks, the doubt. And now, months later, after contracts, promotions, and validation, I understood something fundamental. Your worth is not measured by others' understanding of your vision. It is measured by your fidelity to it, your preparation, and your execution. And when those align, recognition follows not because you demanded it, but because it is inevitable. I sipped my coffee, savoring the warmth, the rhythm of the city, and the quiet satisfaction of having lived this lesson fully. There is a profound dignity in this type of victory. No spectacle, no resentment, no petty gloating, just strategic intelligence, early vision, and integrity proving themselves through action. That dignity is contagious. It empowers others to hold their vision. 2. It models a pathway for grounded influence in spaces that may not initially see your brilliance. Finally, I allowed myself a full, subtle smile. Not one of triumph, not one of revenge, but one of clarity. The lesson was complete. The truth undeniable. Sometimes, being early is mistaken for being wrong, but vision always proves itself in time. And for Black women navigating corporate spaces, that quiet power, held with integrity, preparation, and patience, is not just a survival skill. It is a transformative force. It is brilliance in motion, unseen yet undeniable, silent yet unstoppable. As I set down my mug and turned back to the city, I understood fully. Empowerment isn't a moment, it is a practice. It is consistency. It is patience. It is knowing your worth, trusting your vision, and moving through the world with the quiet certainty that you are right even when no one else yet can see it. And when the time comes, your brilliance will not only be recognized, it will change the room, the company, and the perception of what early vision can achieve. Thanks for taking the time to listen to this story. If it spoke to you, hit subscribe and stay tuned for more stories that heal, inspire, and remind us who we are. For every Black woman told to stay quiet, speak anyway.